When we think about the American Civil War, we often picture the big names, right? The generals, the presidents. But today, we're going to look at it through the eyes of just one family from South Carolina, the Duboses. And you'll see how they lived through completely different versions of the very same war. And that really gets to the heart of what we're exploring. How does a massive, national tragedy become such a personal, intimate story? Well, we'll see it as a desperate fight to defend a way of life, a brutal reality on the battlefield, a constant struggle on the home front, and for some, a long-awaited, whispered hope for freedom. So before we dive deep, let's just get our bearings. The whole thing really kicks off in 1860 when South Carolina secedes. The first shots are fired in 1861, and it all comes to a crashing end in 1865. It's a short timeline, but one that changed absolutely everything. Here's how we're going to break this down. We'll start with A World to Defend. Then we'll get into the soldiers' grim reality and the war on the home front. After that, a really crucial one, Jubilee on the horizon. And we'll wrap it all up with a world transformed. Okay, so let's jump into that first perspective. To really get what's going on, we have to understand what was on the line for a family like the Duboses. What kind of world did they truly believe they were fighting to protect? Well, by 1860, the Dubose family was a big deal, especially in places like Kershaw and Sumter counties in South Carolina. They were part of this powerful elite group, the Southern planter class. Their entire identity, their wealth, their social standing, it was all tied up in the land and the fortunes they made from cotton. And this, right here, is the absolute heart of the matter. For this planter class, and remember, we're talking a small, super wealthy group that held almost all the political power. Slavery wasn't just an economic system. No way. It was the very foundation of their entire society. So when secession happened, their fight was about defending their whole way of life. Everything. So, filled with that sense of duty and what they saw as patriotism, the Dubose men went off to war. But the ideals they were fighting for, well, they slammed right into the brutal, harsh reality of the battlefield. This account from Henry James Dubose, who was in the 4th South Carolina Cavalry, just says it all. He talks about that initial excitement, right? The thrill of defending your new nation. But then, reality hits. Constant danger, never having enough, and watching your friends die. It just shows you that huge gap between the cause and the actual human cost. I mean, for soldiers like Henry and others in the family like Julius Edward Dubose, life just became this relentless grind. We're talking long, grueling marches, being hungry all the time, and this constant threat of disease, which, often killed more soldiers than the fighting did. Henry himself was wounded in a brutal cavalry fight up in Virginia, a constant, painful reminder of the danger. But the battlefield wasn't the only front in this war, not by a long shot. Let's pivot back home, to the plantations, because there, the Dubose women were fighting a completely different kind of battle. One of survival, management, and just constant anxiety. Yeah, sources like the 2 diaries from Middle St. John's really showed the immense weight that was suddenly on their shoulders. They had to run these huge plantations, overseeing harvests, managing the enslaved people who worked the land, all while dealing with crippling shortages of basic things like salts and medicine. And on top of all that, they lived with the constant fear that Union armies could show up at their door at any moment. But now we have to talk about another truly transformative perspective. Because for the hundreds of enslaved people on the Dubose plantations, this war meant something completely different. It wasn't a tragedy to be survived, it was a beacon of hope. According to the WPA slave narratives, this whole period was filled with whispered news. Can you imagine? Rumors of Lincoln's army spreading through the slave quarters, carrying this incredible promise of freedom. They called it the Jubilee, a powerful biblical term for a year of emancipation and restoration. And you can see this power dynamic just completely shifting. As the war drags on and the Confederacy gets weaker, the absolute authority of the plantation owners starts to crumble. And as their power goes down, the hope for freedom among the enslaved population just skyrockets. It was like a seesaw. One world's collapse was giving birth to another's hope. So the war finally ends in 1865. But its conclusion wasn't a single, neat event. It was this earth-shattering moment that meant 2 totally different things depending on who you were. For the returning Confederate soldiers like Henry Dubose, the war's end was a defeat. They came home to economic ruin and a lost cause, a narrative that would soon reframe their fight as a noble one, not one to preserve slavery. But for the newly freed people, that exact same moment was a beginning. Emancipation was their jubilee. It was the start of a difficult, uncertain, but deeply hopeful journey to freedom.
So 1865? It's so much more than just the end of a war. It was the end of the entire world the Duboses had built. For the white family, it became a story of defeat and rebuilding. For the African American families they had enslaved, it was the dawn of freedom. And this brings us right back to our main idea. The story of just this one family shows us that a single historical event can hold multiple, even contradictory truths. So the question for us is, how do we remember a history when there is no single story?